Thuringia may represent just 2% of Germany's population, but the eastern region's no longer an outlier, the far right finishing first in Sunday's regional elections, while also surging in nearby Saxony. True, the AfD, whose lead candidate in Thuringia, Björn Höcke, was twice fined this year for using Nazi-era slogans at rallies, won't be in government. It's precisely with the Nazis in mind that Germany hard-baked moderation and compromise into its federal system. Still, how will these results impact policy in Berlin, in Brussels? There's another layer of Germany's past evoked with these elections. The sudden inroads by anti-immigrant left-wing populist Sarah Vagen, formerly of the communist-rooted Die Linka party. She's playing to make East Germany great again sentiment among voters frustrated by Western-looking policymakers. Both her BSW and the AfD denounce military support for Ukraine, enjoy warm relation with Vladimir Putin's Russia, where all the Cold War-era nostalgia can only be music to the Kremlin's ears. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if it's a radical turn for Germany. And joining us from Berlin, political scientist Daniela Schwarzer, a member of the executive board of the Bertelsmann Foundation. Thank you for being with us. Raphael Loos is policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
She heads operations for Europe at geostrategy consultants EY France. Vanka Krummüller, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
And with us as well from the German capital, France 24 correspondent Jörg Tasman. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me too.
You can always listen. That's right, listen. You can listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. Results branded as bitter by Germany's chancellor. A little over 1 year before Olaf Scholz faces the voters himself in federal elections, he knows that it's on his watch that the far right's finished tops in a regional poll for the first time since World War II. Camille Knight has more on the day after those regional elections.
The morning after two state elections, Germans wake up to dramatic headlines. AfD quake, red for Scholz, reads one of Germany's biggest newspapers. In the eastern state of Thuringia, the party won almost a third of the vote, giving the far right its first win in a state parliament election since the Second World War. For its party leaders, the result gives them a clear mandate to rule and implement its anti-immigration agenda.
What we have seen is a dramatically poor performance by the government coalition. And accordingly, Chancellor Olaf Scholz should draw the consequences and, together with his coalition partners, pack his bags and vacate the premises.
But it's unlikely the AfD will manage to form a regional government in Thuringia, since other parties have publicly stated they wouldn't collaborate. In Saxony too, the party performed well, but came in close second behind the conservative CDU. That's still far ahead of the three parties running the national government, though. For Olaf Scholz's socialist SPD, it's a huge disappointment and a threat to his already weakening coalition.
This election day is a difficult day for the SPD, and it's a difficult day for our democracy. In Thuringia, a party considered by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution to be right-wing extremist has the most votes. And in Saxony, it's not far behind. That should serve as a wake-up call for all of us.
A newly founded radical left party led by Sarah Vagen also came in third in both states, an indication some are growing disillusioned with mainstream political parties. Scholz, for his part, has called on all, quote, democratic parties to form alliances against the far right. The results may be local, but they don't bode well for his coalition ahead of Germany's 2025 federal elections.
Daniela Schwarzer, are these results local or are they a bellwether?
Well, they are, first of all, results from Eastern Germany, where we see a very strong surge of...
Oh, we seem to have lost the connection there. Apologies with Daniela Schwarzer. We'll try to reconnect quickly. Raphael Loos, let's just break this down with a bit of just a stupid civics question here. Because if you add in Thuringia the results of the AfD and the BSW. That amounts to nearly 49% of the vote. Here they are appearing, the BSW in third place in purple. And you see there, my question is, can they really form a state government there in Thuringia without these populist parties?
Well, that's certainly unlikely. Looking at last night's results, there was some talk from the CDU leadership in Thuringia that indicated an opening towards the Bündnis Wagenknecht BSW to potentially form some kind of governing coalition. Although how solid that would be and whether it would last for 5 years is certainly an open question. What AfD and BSW seem to have in common is that they thrive on political chaos to more or less extent. It seems that Sarah Wagenknecht, the leader of BSW, wants to push a foreign policy agenda primarily by engaging in any kind of coalition talks. She's indicated that peace talks between Russia and Ukraine should be on the top of the agenda, even though, of course, state-level executives do not have any say in federal policy decision-making, but that seems to be her strategy to move that very important agenda point up the political agenda.
All right, I think the connection is back with Daniela. The Skype gods rudely cut you off a moment ago. So is this a bellwether, this election?
Well, we see results from 2 Eastern German regions, and there's a third one going to the polls in just 3 weeks' time. And very likely there, the far-right party AfD will also land in first or second position. What we are seeing here in the Eastern German regions is a real change to the political party system with a new far-left party, the BSW, really rising from nowhere to 16%, which is a huge success for them. So we see a pretty strong voter potential for far-right and far-left parties combined. On a national scale, on average, the far-right is, of course, not that strong, but it has been in the German federal parliament for 2 legislatures now. And the big fear is, of course, that in the next federal elections, which will be held in about 1 year's time, if there's no early election, that the far right could also really increase its results and, have a larger parliamentary group.
How do you explain this result?
Well, first of all, I think we have to look at the way the campaigns have been conducted. It's very clear that there was a real blend of campaigning on regional issues, but also on national and even international issues, as we just heard from Raphael Loos. The whole Russia-Ukraine, German support for Ukraine issue was very present and very smartly played out in political constituencies where there is let's say, some affinity to Russia, which is deep-rooted, but also a strong wish for peace and focus on other things than the war. And the problem here is that the far left and the far right combined spoke about their approach towards Ukraine and Russia as the policy that will bring peace, while it said the other parties actually fuel a war if they support Ukraine. Of course, this is a very bitter turn of things because it also has national and European and wider implications if this attitude gains more ground in the German public. But there's also another reason, of course, it's not just foreign policy and Russia in particular. Many people in Germany's East, in particular young people, feel somewhat disconnected. They feel disconnected from Berlin. They feel disconnected from progress that is being made economically in parts of Germany. They feel that infrastructure in their region, for instance, public health infrastructure, transportation, but also schools, are less well equipped. And even if this may not be true to the extent that they sense it is true, it influences their vote. And I think it shows us that after several decades within Germany, we still have 2 very different perceptions of the reality we live in and very different ideas about our own future. And I'll just add one element. after the fall of the wall and the end of the German, sort of Eastern Germany, the GDR, a lot of social infrastructure broke down in Eastern Germany. There was no church structure because in socialist Germany, the church was marginalized. And there was a pretty long void of social and local structures rebuilding. And AfD saw this quite early and started building party structures, but also social structures that support today the parties, like clubs or youth centers or other things. And so we can safely say that this party very early on anticipated its opportunity to really root itself in Eastern German society.
Jörg Tasman, you're sitting in a city that was used to be surrounded by East Germany, Berlin. Is this election about geography?
It partially is. I mean, some of the things are absolutely true, that people in former East Germany, they feel like they're only sitting in second class or even third class. But it's also true that after the fall of the wall at universities, for example, and in many domains, it was West Germans who came, sometimes even unemployed West Germans, taking over, explaining to East Germans what they have to do. And so there was this feeling of not being heard. And another thing is, for example, women in East Germany were basically full employed. East Germany was a society with full employment. So even if you give people money for being unemployed, it was something that they didn't know. So there are a lot of psychological things that have changed. You may say that's all been gone for over 35 years, but apparently it is not. And if you are sometimes in Eastern Germany, which I am, then you hear these kind of stories and they're not necessarily wrong. So this explains partially why AfD is so strong. And we shouldn't forget, Björn Höcke is coming from the West. He is not an East German. He came from the West. He was a teacher in the West. He moved over to East Germany. So this is also something that should be said.
Yeah, news magazine Der Spiegel, which recently put Björn Höcke on its cover. This is the lead candidate for the AfD in Thuringia. There you see him with a drawing of Donald Trump and France's Marine Le Pen above the title, How Fascism Starts. Höcke, which by Der Spiegel is branded as the real boss of the AfD. Let's listen to him on election night, hitting out at the color-coded mainstream parties in Germany.
It doesn't matter whether you vote yellow, red, green, or black. You'll just get more EU, more climate policies, more deindustrialization, more immigration, more multiculti. You'll get more war rhetoric. People don't want this anymore.
Franka Grubmüller, picking up on what Jörg just said, these are boxes that are being ticked all across Germany, not just in the East.
Yes, that's right. And I actually think one important issue that hasn't been mentioned yet that is very important to this AfD electorate is migration. When you look at the numbers, people ask in Thuringia as well as in Saxony, what's the number one issue that you're worried about? Migration comes by far first, almost 40%, almost 45%, and then the next issue, education, 25%. So really, that is one, I think, data point important to keep in mind.
we had just a few weeks ago that stabbing in Solingen. It was done by a young Syrian man whose asylum request had been rejected. How much of an impact did that have on the races?
I mean, in general, in elections, everything that happens in the couple of weeks before the actual election matters a lot because the electorate has that front of mind. That's true in Germany, as it will be true in the US, for example. So that is it always plays a role. But so in general, and for years, migration has been a very big pain point for a lot of people in this part of Germany. And then another poll, which I thought was very interesting, showed that when you ask these people, which party do you think is the most equipped and capable of dealing with your number one priority, they point to the AfD, which has been positioning on migration for years after they turned away from the Eurozone issue, right? So I think there's a link there just about the fact that people care or think that the AfD might have the solution to their biggest problem.
And is Der Spiegel right? Is Björn Höcke the real power behind the throne inside of that party?
I mean, as it is the case in a lot of parties, including in extremist parties, there's always factions that fight, and then depending on the issue of the day, parts of the factions win and others not. I do believe that the AfD, like we've also seen in France with the Rassemblement National, is trying to find the right spot between still continuing to speak to the electorate, but also not pushing away other parts of the electorate that they can potentially gain.
I guess, Raphael Losa, otherwise put, how toxic is it in the eyes of ordinary voters? I'm thinking again ahead to next year's federal election. Is the AfD considered a fringe party by most Germans?
Unfortunately, less and less so, I think, even though the two elections and the third one in Brandenburg later this month do take place in a particular political context, a particular social, historical, economic context. We also see in parts of West Germany, the AfD gaining grounds, even though from a much lower baseline. What Björn Höcke has succeeded at is in moving his party from this Eurozone critical stance in the early 2010s to nationalist party, an extremist right party. Björn Höcke legitimately can be called a fascist leader, but he hasn't succeeded in putting his personnel.
It isn't just a coincidence when he uses Nazi-era slogans. He knows what he's doing.
No, he knows what he's doing. We've established that he was a history teacher. He knows very well what he's doing. He's playing with political symbolism from the 1930s in order to make a point. And particularly concerning some exit polls from Saxony and Thuringia are that more and more AfD voters vote for the party because they like their messages, they like their program, they like their stance. The AfD is no longer a protest party. For most of their voters, it's now core of the electorate that is convinced by their policies, and that's extremely concerning.
Jörg Tasman, things seem to wax and wane in Eastern Germany because we remember just after reunification in the early 90s, there was a lot of focus on far-right skinheads in some East German cities. That seemed to have gone away, and now suddenly we have this surging. How do you explain this?
Well, again, East Germany was officially an anti-fascist country. So everything that had to deal with fascism was supposed to be over because we had, that was the idea of the Communist Party, that we had overcome fascism in East Germany. So if you always shovel something under the carpet, then it might re-emerge. And some of the skinhead leaders were, for example, their parents were communists. So it was also a form of rebellion with some of the skinhead movement at the time. It was just also that East Germany was a closed country. There were some tourists, maybe very few, coming maybe to the major cities, but they had no real, they couldn't travel except for certain countries within the Eastern Bloc. And in East Germany, they didn't have this kind of what they call now multiculti. So this kind of international influence totally was not the case. So I think that explains some of it. And let's not forget, the AfD has 32%, but there are again 68% who did not vote for the AfD. And what happens now in these two East German states is something that is normal in France, that is normal in Italy, that is normal in Holland. So then again, it is shocking, and I am shocked, but Germany just has reached now the level that other European countries have reached long before Germany.
Yeah, Daniela Schwarzer at the outset of this conversation stating how perhaps the biggest unknown or new elements in these elections may have in fact been the rise suddenly of this left-wing populist party. Now, remember when here in France, Emmanuel Macron entered politics and founded a party, En Marche, that bore his own initials? Well, former parliamentary leader of Die Linka, Sarah Wagenknecht, did one better. Her breakaway leftist party is called the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance. Eliza Herbert has more on that.
For more than a decade, she was a lightning rod and leading figure for Germany's Left Party. Then, in October last year, she quit Die Linka and by January had forged her own, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, known as BSW. She promised voters change, and on Sunday they responded, affording her alliance up to 16% of the vote in the legislative election in the state of Thuringia, coming in third and making her a kingmaker for potential coalitions.
People want a stable government, a majority government. Above all, however, they want a government that represents their interests and tackles their problems. We very much hope that together with the CDU, we will end up with a good government.
Her alliance, branded by many as the conservative left, draws on policy from both the far right and far left. On the one hand, she wants to limit immigration by, for example, cutting off aid to refugees who have been refused asylum. On the international front, she wants to initiate an agreement with Moscow and put an end to arms deliveries to Ukraine. But as a Karl Marx scholar, she also advocates higher minimum wages, better pensions and taxes on the richest.
We are now going to change politics in Germany together, and we are doing so because we feel that something is changing in our society. There are so many problems, so many uncertainties, but also so much indignation and anger.
In less than 8 months, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance has become a political force to be reckoned with, particularly in its regional strongholds in eastern Germany. At the end of the 2 regional elections, she could negotiate a hard-fought coalition agreement with the conservative CDU.
Yeah, just 8 months. Daniela Schwarzer, is this a new phenomenon, or is it simply kind of a, I guess you could call it a palace coup after all? She comes from Die Linka. In 8 months, suddenly having all these new voters, are her policies any different from Die Linka?
Well, she was already very outspoken when she was on the Linka's leadership. The interesting thing now is that her party managed to get about 16% from nothing. And she didn't only take votes from Die Linke, but she took votes from other political parties. So she has seemingly an attractive message. She speaks to the fears and concerns of the citizens, and she didn't start yesterday, actually. A few years ago, she wrote a book.
We seem to again have a Skype issue there. Apologies for that with Daniel. You're back, Daniel. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm so sorry for this bad line. So she basically wrote a book a while ago where she picked up all the fears that now materialize, of people worried about their socioeconomic future, feeling disconnected, feeling left behind. And she finds a way of really taking people along, and she combines this with a pretty aggressive foreign policy stance, which puts real pressure on the federal government.
Real pressure, Famke Grummelin.
Well, yes, in the rhetoric, definitely. I do think what is important to keep in mind is that in foreign policy terms, the German Länder don't have any power in Germany, and they do have a lot of power on other issues, which I think is very important to keep in mind. But on foreign policy, from a rhetorical perspective, also because she now managed to get, as Daniela clearly said, from zero to so high, so much attention for these stances, there will be pressure on the government, which at the same time now is trying to negotiate the next budget. There's a couple of millions missing. So it will inevitably lead to a conversation about how much more support for Ukraine in this context, that's for sure.
Now, speaking of drifting away from the center, Wagenknecht's second husband, none other than the 80-year-old reunification-era leader of the Social Democrats at the time, Oscar Lafontaine, whose political path has led him to his spouse's movement. And there again, Jörg Tasman, he's from near the French border, and yet here he is in the news once again.
Yes, of course, he was a very important figure within the SPD. Then he left the SPD. He broke up with Gerhard Schröder at the time. And then he founded Die Linke, which was first called a different name. But anyway, he founded it, and it was a merger between West-left politics and Eastern German left-wing politicians. Gregor Gysi, for example, he was the strongman in former East Germany. So yes, in a way, he's back again after he criticized heavily Die Linke. I mean, he left the party way before Sarah Wagenknecht. And I think what has to be said about Sarah Wagenknecht too is she was very frustrated with the leadership of Die Linke during the COVID epidemic, because actually Die Linke and Bodo Ramelow in Thüringen, first he said he would not support all the measures, and then he did support all the measures. So she was very outspoken also and very critical about a lot of the corona policy, and that's where she gained a lot of sympathy.
Yeah, there is this COVID effect on politics, and we're seeing it in a lot of countries, Raphael Loss.
It does seem to be a COVID hangover. It had enormous implications for social life, for economic life, both of them denting prospects for Germany's and Europeans' youth. And we see now big support from young voters in particular for the AfD, for example, in Saxony and Thuringia, and likely in other parts of Germany as well. The future prospects, I think, are something that Sarah Wagenknecht and Björn Höcke are able to capture quite effectively. They both run politics by drawing on strong narratives, by hammering down messages, by building a certain narrative framework for their voters, for their core voters, but expanding that to other electorates that feeds on fears about the future, and those, of course, all the reasons that we've discussed.
So, are they going to, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, are they going to move the needle? Are they going to, because there's been a 180-degree turn when it comes to defense policy in Germany. Now, with these regional elections, is that going to have an impact on federal policy?
Not through formal policy channels, but certainly by fomenting a certain political discourse in Germany that makes it very hard for the other mainstream pro-democratic parties to sustain support for Ukraine, to sustain sanctions on Russia, to sustain Germany's defense policy Zeitenwende. That is for sure, yes.
Is there a link between the Kremlin and these parties?
I think intellectually, certainly there are linkages. The Washington Post reported last year, I believe, about a formal Kremlin plan to foment a Querfront in Germany between Sarah Wagenknecht's alliance, between the AfD and some other left extremist figures. We don't know if that plan has been implemented to any degree, but what we see, certainly the ideological alignments between the Kremlin and Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht and the Kremlin and the AfD is a very concerning linkage that is not giving me hope for the future of mainstream German politics.
Do you agree with that, Daniela Schwarzer? You've got the same concern?
Yes, I do share that concern. And just on the Russia issue, why it matters, don't have a real impact. But the fact is that they put the mainstream parties under considerable pressure to explain to the German audience more and more why public money has to be spent on Ukraine. And it's getting more and more difficult to make people understand why it is so important to support Ukraine in its war against Russia, its defense against Russia's aggression. Because people now get some kind of war fatigue, even in countries that are peaceful, and say this war should be ended. And both Sarah Wagenknecht and the AfD basically argue it's possible to make peace with Vladimir Putin. It is possible to find a deal with Russia, and do not really acknowledge that with Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine, and that he didn't stick to international law. So I think there's a real political challenge, even if we are discussing results now, which are only on a regional level, the impact will be national.
Famke Krummüller, we had the Polish foreign minister this weekend saying if there are missiles fired near us, we should be able to shoot them down. Here in France, we thought there would be war fatigue a lot more. It hasn't happened that much, although there are parties who do use the Kremlin's language when it calls for calling for peace. But they're definitely a minority. Is Germany different? What's the difference with Germany?
Well, I'm not sure it's that different. What is very different and important to understand is, as we just mentioned, there has been a 180 degrees turn in Germany, a cultural turn from a country that really nobody wanted to spend more on the military and was all about kind of being an economic superpower, etc., to now this very harsh and sudden realization of we need to change our strategy. And of course, kind of culture, political culture, does not change from one day to another, even if it's driven by such extreme events. I think that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind, that this is something that is structurally just takes some time. And of course, and I think this is true for many European countries, there was always going to be this moment when it was going to get more complicated in the economic context that we're in, etc., to explain to the electorate, as was just highlighted as well, how important it is to continue to spend money on helping Ukraine defend itself.
But it seems to be more of a problem in Germany than it does in, say, France or Poland.
Well, I think, for example, if we compare it to Poland, and Poland does not have that culture change. Poland has always lived next to its big Russian neighbor, and I think in Poland it probably requires less explanation to the public how this is so central and so important. Whereas in Germany it does. And in Germany, there is an environment now where there are many other issues as well, as I just said, where people just don't understand why should we send money there into the Ukrainian pot when we actually want it spent on education and on other issues. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to explain.
Jörg Tasman, how much of this is down to, I guess, forgive my pronunciation, to what they call nostalgie, a nostalgia for the way it was back in the days when you had East Germany, known as the German Democratic Republic. Is there really that much nostalgia? And is that nostalgia just among the old or also among the young?
That's very difficult to answer because there is something like nostalgia, of course, that exists, especially amongst the older generation. But what's interesting is that even those who didn't even grow up anymore in East Germany, who were born after the fall of the wall, through their parents, for example, they kind of have this kind of nostalgia too. I think there's nothing wrong in remembering some of the better parts of East Germany. I myself, I was born in East Germany and moved to France when I was 14 years old. But anyway, there were things, I think, that people didn't dare to say they're East Germans. And it's very interesting when I meet somebody and I sense he might be East German and he's my generation, it takes them a while, if we meet in the West, to admit I was actually born in East Germany. So there's kind of shame going on with a lot of people. And we should not forget that a lot of West Germans that don't have a clue about East Germany. Still, until today, they don't travel there. They have never been there. So there is still a big gap between East and West Germany, and one doesn't talk about it. And I remember that when there were films being made like Goodbye Lenin, first it was said nobody wants to talk about East Germany anymore. Nobody wants to hear that. That has changed. There have been good series made, good films made, good books written. So on a cultural level, I think there has been a kind of rehabilitation. But if we just look at the leading politicians today, I mean, Angela Merkel, she was from the East, but since she's gone, nobody who's in power nowadays in Germany is from the East.
Raphael Loos, you feel the stigma when you're in Berlin and some of the people you encounter are born in the East and others are born in the West?
I was born in the West, so I don't have firsthand knowledge of the lived experience of people of my generation that were born in parts of the country that were previously the GDR. But what friends have told me is that just a quick example, they would have the cultural knowledge of what childhood was like in West Germany. They were familiar with Disney movies, kids' TV shows, and so on and so forth. And I would have a hard time to come up with anything that I know from former East Germany that was formative for a lot of people's lived experiences in the 80s and the 90s. And so there's this gap, this cultural gap, and that has been feeding, I think, a sense of disrespect, a sense of disenfranchisement. Germans across the country, people in West Germany, political leaders, I think, need to do to make good on that front, but that doesn't discount the fact anti-democratic parties do gain in elections in East Germany more than in West Germany, and that is something that people in East Germany also need to find.
Okay, so Danielle Schwarzer, how do politicians adjust their rhetoric? We seem to have lost Daniela once again. With the connection there. I'll put the question to you, Fanke Krubmüller. This whole question comes up, is coming up more than it was in the past. So, how do you? How are with so few, as you just heard Jörg say, people born in the East right now in positions of power? How do they adjust their rhetoric? How do they represent the people at the federal level?
Well, I mean, I think if I may zoom out a little bit from Germany and go to Europe, I think there's a general question right now in Europe, because we see this phenomenon in other European countries where the more extreme populist parties on both the extreme left and the extreme right get support from a big part of the electorate that does not feel represented by the mainstream parties, because they feel like the mainstream parties just don't capture their actual problems and then don't have a solution to that. So,
yeah, we just saw that in the UK, where the Labour Party wins by a landslide, but only because the far right took votes from the Conservatives.
Right, and we see it in France, and we've seen it in Italy. We've seen it in a lot of the big European countries. So I think you ask about rhetoric, and maybe also action, there's a real need for the centrist parties, and this is a trend that has been going on arguably for more than 10 years, that need to find a way to kind of take in the, of course, legitimate concerns by the electorate and find a solution to it. The challenge, of course, is that populists always have an easier time providing seemingly simple solutions, whereas more mainstream parties have the economic reality, fiscal reality, international reality, etc., to deal with.
Right. Let's give a few concrete examples just from the past week. Britain's new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he was in Berlin for a reset of relations. On the same day he met Olaf Scholz. Back in London, his government also announced plans for a major surge in deportations of failed asylum seekers, while another center-left leader, Pedro Sanchez, went to Mauritania, the Gambia, Senegal to talk up plans for keeping West African migrants from traveling to Spain's shores. With those two examples, Famke, are they doing what you say, which is addressing what the electorate wants, or are they chasing after those populists you mentioned?
That is now the challenge, of course, for the centrist parties, if I can put them into that big bucket. It is on the one hand, and I'm not saying I have the solution here, obviously, on the one hand, addressing these issues, but at the same time, not just jumping into the populist rhetoric. All political science studies show that a move to the extremes, to the right or to the left, to capture the vote from that part of the electorate does not necessarily work. So that is the challenge that they face, and clearly there's no easy solution because, as I say, this is nothing new.
Daniela Schwarzer, 5 years ago, right now they're putting together the casting for the new European Commission. And 5 years ago, the last time they did it, it was 2019. It was before COVID. It was before Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion. The hot topic, pardon the pun, was the climate emergency. Now it seems to be migration. And so, again, is it these populist parties that are driving the agenda?
To some extent, they are changing or putting pressure on the other parties to change their positions. Look at, for instance, the debate we have now among German mainstream parties on migration. That has changed. The AfD is an outright climate denying party that doesn't have effect on the federal government, at least, which pursues its climate change agenda. But we also saw Ursula von der Leyen, the the outgoing and incoming EU Commission President, during her campaign for re-election, strike a quite different tone on climate change. Now she has become more ambitious again, and so we cannot say there's no effect by the populists, but some issues are indeed so pressing. I do not believe that the new European Commission or the European Parliament in the next 5 years will actually go back and deconstruct the climate policies it has put in place. But maybe we will see a slowdown of other initiatives that have been planned.
Will we see Germany reversing some of the ambitious policies we've seen? Jörg Tasman, we talked about defense, but also when it comes to climate.
That might very well happen if there is a new government in place soon. Let's not forget the so-called traffic light government right now, the Ampel coalition, has 1 year left, and it doesn't look good for them, especially not after the elections yesterday. The big question is, will they even make it till next year? And it's obvious that if we just look at the evolution with electric cars, Germans don't buy electric cars, so everybody's back on fuel again. So that's just one sign. There have been, I think the Christian Democrats would love to bring atomic power back to Germany. So I think next year there will be a big change because we will have a different government, and that will be a right-wing government with the Christian Democrats. And they will, I think, roll back on many points of climate change. I'm quite convinced of that.
And there'll be a rolling back, very briefly, Raphael Loss, of the policies we've seen over the last 4 years out of Germany?
I'm not so sure. I think some of the decisions that the traffic light coalition took are quite sticky. If we look at CO2 pricing, for example, then that was something that was agreed upon by Angela Merkel's last grand coalition, implemented by the traffic light coalition, but generally a market-based approach to climate policy, and that does have proponents in the CDU as well. On other fronts, the traffic light coalition hasn't gone quite as far as this Zeitenwende rhetoric might have seen. There are significant struggles with the defense policy question and investment in military. There are significant questions about social policy and housing that are left resolved. This will be problems that the next coalition government, regardless of who's part of it, will have to tackle in order to prove that democratically minded policymakers, leaders, can indeed effectively govern this country and thereby attempt to take some air out of AfD and BSW to not have them gain further ground at federal level. We shouldn't overemphasize the results from Saxony and Thuringia. They're important and I think a historical watershed, but the average German voter is quite different. And the election in those two states should not be seen as a foreboding at the next federal elections in September 2025.
If there's one thing that's for sure, and we're discovering it here in France, is that whatever the outcome, there will be coalition talks that will follow. Raphael Loss, many thanks. I want to thank Daniela Schwarzer as well, Jörg Tasman for being with us from the German capital. Famke Krummüller, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.